like it's like candy bars. You just you have a guilty pleasure for them. All right, well, I guess we'll get started, and there may be more people who come rolling in. This is our last part of this 9-part series that we started just after the election, which seems like it was a long time ago. Although we should keep in mind that the period between the election and the inauguration used to be even longer. The inauguration didn't happen until the beginning of March. There was another 6 weeks beyond what it is now. I think it was changed, I want to say around the time of FDR. I wouldn't swear to it. But in any event, what I want to do this evening is present what I will call a non-partisan Jewish voters guide. I'm not interested in talking about political parties. I'm not interested in talking about particular presidents, especially most recently. You may wonder how we avoid that, but I will. And I also want to enable some conversation at the end of at the end of my presentation, because I think that if we look at history and particularly look at some of the personalities we came to view through a historical lens, I do think in the aggregate, some traits, some things to look for in candidates of either stripe, of either political party, are well worth considering as American Jews or Jewish Americans, depending on which is the modifier and which is the noun. But that these are things that would be well worth any Democrat, any Republican, and any independent to think about as an American Jew going into the voting booth. But I want to, go back a little bit. I'm going to put up a chart in just a moment, but to look at Jewish voting patterns. Now, first of all, there were no exit polls back in the 19th century. And exit polls are not necessarily, scriptural, biblical. They're not, God's truth. They are, but they can be helpful. Certainly before the turn of the 20th century, there really was no way to gauge percentages of who and what group voted for which party or which president. However, on the basis of sermons, articles, campaign materials, we can make some pretty, I think, fairly accurate statements, so long as we don't try to assign numbers to them. So while most Jewish Americans today belong to the Democratic Party, about a third of American Jews are Republican, but for those who are affiliated, closer to 2/3 are Democrats. And that may be, that's not surprising. What may be surprising to folks is that in the mid-19th century, remember the Republican Party was only formed in 1860, but throughout the mid to late 19th century, most Jews appear to have been Republican. And based on those materials that I alluded to a moment before, the German Jewish community admired Lincoln greatly and the party of Lincoln. And that afterglow continued throughout much of the 19th century. And indeed, until pretty much the end of the century, McKinley is the last president who was an officer during the Civil War and who could speak of Civil War experiences and could speak of having had some personal experience with Abraham Lincoln. The idea of being the party of freedom, the party of union, the party of abolition, right? Now it's true that though the names are the same and we have this sense of continuity between the Republican Party of 1860 and the Democratic Party of that same era and today, the characters of both parties have changed enormously over the course of the last 160 years and more. So the Republican Party was very different then than it is today. And indeed, the Democratic Party of the mid-19th century was filled with segregationists, or at least those who had a very high tolerance for segregation. It was the party of Southern conservatism. It was the party that apologized for slavery. And so the Democratic Party was opposed to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? That granted the vote to Black males, that extended the rights of citizenship, birth citizenship, and of course the abolition of slavery. And until the post-World War II period, the South was solidly Democratic. The first cracks are really in the time of Harry Truman, when Strom Thurmond, runs under the Dixiecrat banner in 1948, and then as Truman integrates the army, and then of course JFK speaks a lot about civil rights, and then of course LBJ does a lot about civil rights. Those were things that began to occasion a shift in political leanings in the South. There were two crucial changes that would flip Jewish party affiliation historically. A massive influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, where many had been influenced by left-wing thought. These Eastern European Jews were poor. They lived in crowded tenements. They worked blue-collar jobs. So the Democratic Party in the early years of the 20th century began to reorient its message toward labor, toward immigrants. And this was further expedited by the Great Migration of Black Americans to the North. And 6 million Black Americans moved from the South to the North in the early years of the 20th century, and then even more rapidly after World War I. So the new version of the Democratic Party was perceived by many of these Jews to be a better fit. I'm not saying that as a qualitative or partisan statement, just as a historical one, as you look at the percentages and it is what it is. So the already established Jewish Americans followed the ideology that had once made them Republicans, but now made them Democrats. And we'll see this play itself out really toward the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm going to put up this chart. Let's see. Right. There we go. We're going to share the screen. All right. Okay. Can everybody see that? It's not so bright, but I will do my best to, so obviously red is Republican, blue is Democrat, hasn't changed. But we'll see, and what's interesting here is that the Jewish vote is compared to the national vote as a whole. And we'll see sometimes the Jewish vote reflects the national vote and sometimes it doesn't. Woodrow Wilson gets a decisive 55-45. Charles Hughes was the Republican candidate. Wilson's numbers among the Jewish vote were not so different than the general vote. Now, in 1920, actually, Warren Harding is more popular than Jacob Cox. So Warren Harding has the distinction of being the last president that gets, that essentially commands a Jewish majority for Republicans. So since 1920, Jews have not, given the majority of their vote to any Republican candidate. But look what's interesting here. Eugene V. Debs, who's the socialist, right? Can you imagine a socialist getting 38% of the vote today? 38% of the Jewish vote, only 3% of the national vote. Right? But that's pretty significant. But that also tells you a lot about that community. So 43% voted for Harding, the Republican candidate, but 38% voted for Eugene V. Debs, the socialist. By the way, just a little piece of trivia. If ever you're in New York and you listen to WEVD, this is a foreign, it's sort of an immigrant radio station that goes back a long, long ways. The EVD stands for Eugene V. Debs. It has some really great Jewish programming, but it also has Polish programming. It has Italian, Hungarian, and all kinds of things. But it was the call letters were named in honor of the socialist Eugene V. Debs, WVD. In 1924, Coolidge does not do very well. 27% of the Jewish vote, but 54% of the general electorate. 28, Al Smith. Now, Al Smith had been the governor of New York, was a Catholic. He's the first Catholic to run for office. He is known as having close relationship to Jews. There's a tremendous amount of anti-Catholicism that emerges in the 1928 campaign. The KKK was passionately anti-Catholic, and a resurgent KKK, not the original KKK, but a resurgent KKK in the 1920s was, if anything, more virulently anti-Catholic than racist, anti-Semitic too. But among Jews, Smith gets 72% of the vote. We're a small minority among the larger voters. So Hoover gets 58%, and Smith only gets 41% of the general vote. But it's an interesting. So Here is an underdog. Here is somebody who is viewed as being almost a first cousin of the Jewish community. He knew some Yiddish phrases, and he did quite well in the Jewish community, but obviously not well enough. Now look what happened. So Smith gets 72%, but now we see FDR. Right, we saw that he got the highest Jewish percentages. In fact, to this day, 82% in 32, 57 of the general population, 85 in 1936 versus 61%. 1940, he gets 90%. There's never been a candidate that has gotten a higher percentage. And in 44, he maintains 90%. Right? Notice it's 53% of the general population, but 90% of the Jewish population. Truman, 75%. 48 was a very close election. You may have seen that famous picture of Truman holding up the newspaper saying Dewey wins. For those who stayed up late enough in the night, it was not Dewey who won, but so sure were some of the newspapers that they went ahead and printed the banner headlines. But Truman gets 75% of the Jewish vote. Okay, Wallace, who was the left-wing candidate, still garners 15%, as opposed to 2% nationally. So, if you're seeing a pattern here, it's only because there is. In 52, Stevenson, almost 2-1, 64%. Adlai Stevenson to 36%. 20% of 64% in the Jewish community versus 44% in the general community. The Jews aren't always voting for the winners. And Roosevelt, they did. They had a 4-time winner, then Truman. But in 52, the majority of Jews voted for the losing candidate. They did the same in 56. Stevenson. Now in 60, Kennedy gets 82% of the Jewish vote. Some of that. Now look at, if you know how close the 60 election was, it was 50 versus 50. It came down to, it was a very, very tight race. It's not like we haven't had tight races in American history. And there's been a winner and a loser. And anyway, Kennedy gets 82%, right? Which puts him roughly around the same level as Roosevelt in his first election. Some of it may be his boyish charm, but some of it is clearly this idea of his being an outsider. I mean, even though ironically, the Kennedys in so many ways were not outsiders. And Joe Kennedy, his father, was no friend of Jews. Joe Kennedy was quite an anti-Semite and had a sneaking admiration for Hitler, and was something of one of the America First, Charles Lindbergh types. But that's another story. The sins of the father shall not be visited upon the children. That's what Deuteronomy says. And looks like the American Jewish community heeded that advice. Johnson, 90%. That puts him right up there. He ties with Roosevelt. Humphrey was 81 versus Nixon. Nixon being 17, I believe that says, 17. In 68, there were not that many Jews voting for Nixon. I think we mentioned 2% did vote for George Wallace. Who they were, God knows. McGovern was a big loser, but Jews voted for McGovern. Nixon did a lot better in his second campaign. This is before the Yom Kippur War, but he still did considerably better. But still McGovern. Again, the margin was 2-1. Carter and Ford, 71-27. Reagan, and this was a relatively close one. Carter and Reagan. Carter in his 1980 had 45 versus Reagan's 39. And then, of course, Anderson came in, third-party candidate. It'd be interesting to know, would, I mean, the 15% of Jews, Jewish voters voted for Anderson. Would that have gone more to Reagan or more to Carter? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But Carter was perceived to have been, he bungled. Yes. Now it's true that there were the peace agreement with Sadat, the Camp David Accord. Right. So, but he also bungled the rescue of the hostages in Iran. I remember that, vividly. I guess I was in high school, senior in high school. In 84, Mondale, right? Reagan has become this iconic American president, but even though Mondale, clearly was a loser, it was 57 versus 31. Dukakis. I mean, Dukakis got his pedeshvis kicked, but more Jews voted for Dukakis than Bush. And Clinton got up to 80, a little less the second time around. Gore was 79% to Bush 19, pretty lopsided. Ralph Nader had not too many people. In 04 was Kerry, 76 to 24. Obama 78-22, and then 69 to 30. Hillary Clinton had 71, Trump only 24, and then Biden 76 versus 22. So there, I think, I'm not saying, history is destiny. It's not. Jews were once Republicans, and then they became Democrats over a period of decades. The parties also changed. But we have seen a consistency here. And we can like it or dislike it. But historically, to note the consistency is nonpartisan. That's just historically accurate. So all Jews did in 2020 was to do what they've done pretty much since 1916, except for the Harding administration. And I don't know why Harding was so popular. I suspect it may have been because Jacob Cox wasn't. But anyway, so that is that for the chart. That's a little bit of historical background. So now let's just fast forward to our time. And in particular, I'm sure all of you have heard about the 2013 Pew survey of Jewish Americans. So what did the Pew survey find that would perhaps impact on our priorities as a community? So right? The Pew research, not surprisingly, found that Jews support the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. About 70% say they're Democrats, 22% say they're Republicans. It has gone up a little bit. The Democrats have gone down a little bit. The Republican numbers have come up a little bit. But, still overwhelmingly so. Now, people can be very strident on one side of the spectrum or the other, but the volume of one's strident character doesn't necessarily, that just tells you the volume. It doesn't tell you the quantity of voters on one side or the other. But here's the thing, among the Orthodox, the balance is in the other direction. Non-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews have shown a split in party affiliation in particularly the last 20 plus years, more and more. So 57% of those who identify as Orthodox are Republican or lean Republican, and 36% are Democrat or lean Democrat. Now, when respondents were asked, what does it mean to be Jewish? And this was all people who responded, those who consider themselves Jewish by culture versus Jewish by religion. So this is the all-inclusive answer. Okay. What does it mean to be Jewish? The percentage saying that blank, we'll fill in the blank in a moment, is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them. Number one answer, at 73%, remembering the Holocaust. That was far and away, that was the most important thing to being Jewish. Okay. The second most important thing, leading an ethical / moral life. That came into 69%. The third, working for justice and equality, 56%. The fourth, being intellectually curious. That was 49%. And the fifth, Israel, was 43%. Right? So what we'll see is that, Israel is up there. 43% is not an insignificant number, caring about Israel. However, there are at least any number of traits that are, or values or priorities that are ahead of Israel in line. By the way, right behind Israel at 42%, having a good sense of humor. What does it mean to be Jewish? To have a good sense of humor. 42% said that was, so it's almost tied with Israel. 28% said being part of a Jewish community. 19% said observing Jewish law. And 14% said eating traditional Jewish foods. I don't know if these numbers surprise you. They don't surprise me. They don't thrill me, but they don't surprise me. Right, but I just want to highlight that fact of where Israel is on this list, kind of halfway down. But pursuing justice, equality, leading an ethical or moral life, came out with significantly higher standing. And the next thing that the Pew research found, they asked about attachment and attitudes about Israel. They were really looking to drill down. Right, and here they broke it down into those who identified as a Jew by religion and those who identified as a Jew of no religion. In other words, secular Jews who saw their identity in terms of culture, peoplehood, maybe ethnic traditions, but not necessarily in a religious context. So very attached to Israel, 30%. All right, so a minority, right? 39% said they were somewhat attached to Israel. 31% said not very, not at all. So 39% were somewhat attached to Israel. 31 said not at all, or, not very. And only 30 said they were very attached. Now, not surprisingly, if you go into Jews by religion, those numbers go, the not very attached goes down, the very attached goes up, the somewhat attached goes up. And Jews of no religion, only 12% said they were very attached. 33% said somewhat, 55% said not very. This is a Jewish community that cares about Israel, but it's not its number one issue. Been to Israel. 43% said yes, 57% said no. That was the net number. For those who are Jews of no religion, 77% said they hadn't been to Israel. Among those who identified as Jewish by religion, the number was pretty much even. 49% had been, 51% hadn't, but it was pretty much of an even split. Impact of continued building of Jewish settlements on Israel's security. 17% said it helps. 44% said it hurts. 29% said it doesn't make a difference. That was the net. If you go into Jews by religion, only 19% said it helps. 40% said settlements in the West Bank hurt Israel's security. 31% said no difference. Right, so across the board, by different percentages, but most American Jews did not feel that settlement building on the West Bank helped Israel. And then interestingly, the last question they asked in the attachment attitudes about Israel, do you believe God gave Israel to the Jewish people? Well, 28% didn't believe in God, so they couldn't really answer that question. I guess they were no by default. 40% said yes. That was in the aggregate. 47% among those who are Jewish by religion, only 16% of those who were secular in their Jewish identity. Interestingly, across the board, 27% said no. Jews by religion, Jews by no religion, and Jews, just in the aggregate. So the upshot is Israel remains a subject of significance to Jewish voters, but patterns reveal that Jews are not one-issue voters. Healthcare, gun control, taxes, government spending, separation of church and state, abortion, immigration. Jews care about those issues as much as they do about Israel. So I'm surprised when some folks are surprised that American Jews, when they are voting, going into that they are not simply only thinking about Israel. And speaking as an individual now, not as, rabbi, just as Jonathan Lubliner, I am an American. I am a passionate supporter of Israel. I have spent significant time there. I would love one day to consider making Aliyah, though I don't know that my wife would feel the same way. But I live here. I am a citizen here. I'm not a citizen of the state of Israel. As deeply as I care about Israel, I'm also an American. For me to only vote on one issue is to in essence, to say that all of these other things that I care about, from the environment to church and state to taxes to all of these things that I have no interest in those things. I can't say that. I fully understand when Israelis in opinion polls about elections consistently only think about how a particular candidate will affect Israel. Of course, they're Israelis taking an opinion poll. They don't have to worry about taxes in the United States. They got plenty of their own to pay. But to be invested in American democracy as American Jews, it is important that we feel invested in the country in which we live and our citizens and are patriotic about. And it's not an either or. Israel is very, very important to me when I think about the candidate I will support. But I think about other things too. And I suspect most Jewish Americans, like other Americans, do the same. So that's one takeaway, that Jews are not, one issue voters. Another takeaway is that Jews seem to feel that a basic commitment to Israel's security and existence has been integral in both parties. And let's just cut through the partisanship and the rhetoric. Jews, whether they're right or wrong, Jews seem to feel that way because Israel is something they care about. It may not be the top of the list, but they care about it. And if they felt that one party or another represented, a horrible danger, Israel, I'm not so sure that the votes would play themselves out as they have since the state of Israel was established. Right? Jews didn't vote for Nixon, but Nixon was a great friend of Israel. So there is a sense that part of American foreign policy traditionally and historically has involved bipartisanship when it comes to Israel. I'm going to play a very brief clip. Let's see. Let's see. Here we go. It's not even 2 minutes. Back here. Put that there. Okay. Up. This big. And I will optimize share. Okay. All righty, and this. Yeah, okay. Here we go.
Politics in America is contentious. In fact, by some measures, Democrats and Republicans are more divided today than at any other time in the last 2 decades. But America's support for Israel transcends partisan politics. So when it comes to strengthening America's relationship with Israel, support must come from both sides of the aisle. That's where AIPAC comes in. For decades, AIPAC has worked to strengthen, protect, and promote the U.S.-Israel alliance by encouraging bipartisan support in Congress. Bipartisanship is more than just a nice idea. It's the most effective way to build a lasting consensus to support Israel. There are two practical reasons why. First, a partisan approach will ultimately fail when the opposing party inevitably comes into power. Bipartisanship is the only way to affect policies that keep Israel safe, no matter which party is in control. Second, consider the math. While most bills require a simple majority to pass, in the Senate, each senator has the right to filibuster or block a bill's consideration. To overcome that opposition, a bill needs the support of 3/5 of the Senate, which one party rarely holds. Therefore, as the years go by, a consistently pro-Israel Congress requires the support of both parties through a bipartisan approach. Thank you for working with AIPAC to ensure that America continues to stand with Israel through strong bipartisan support in Congress.
Okay, well, AIPAC said it better than I could. But I do want to say this. In the Non-Partisan Jewish Voters Guide to picking future presidents, we have to be wary about those who want to weaponize Israel as a political wedge. There was a very good article that Abe Foxman wrote about this. The state of Israel should never be a tool or a means to a partisan end. For us who support Israel, the Jewish state is just too important for it to become a partisan issue. So I would suggest that we need to look to presidents who are committed to maintaining bipartisan support, rather than to make it either a carrot or, for that matter, a stick. Right? Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, neither of them won the majority of the Jewish vote. We saw last time around that it really bothered Nixon deeply. But tellingly, neither made loyalty a litmus test for supporting Israel. When push came to shove during the Yom Kippur War, Nixon was there for a lot of reasons, but in part because of an assumption of bipartisanship when it came to Israel. And that's the way it was for much, not all, of Israel's existence. We also have to, I think, consider that American presidents will adopt different approaches to specific policies. You know, one state versus two, how to handle Iran. Jews themselves have a variety of views across the spectrum. Now, regardless of where you are, to the left or to the right, when we don't agree with whoever the president is, let's say so clearly, but without demonizing that person and without burning bridges. Disagreements over specific policies shouldn't be elevated to hyperbolic litmus tests of loyalty or disloyalty. So when we are looking of whom to support, and again, I'm going to suggest that depending on where you are on the economy, on gun control, on immigration, on a variety of issues, that whether you're of the left or the right, factor those in. But in looking for a basic, fundamental threshold beyond compromise, any presidential candidate for us as a Jewish community should be committed, number one, to Israel maintaining a qualitative military edge. Number two, is willing to push for recognition of Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state among the region's players, including Palestinians. Number three, oppose BDS. And number four, if possible, facilitate peace, but that may not be possible. But at least 1, 2, and 3. As Hillel once said, everything else is commentary. But I think those three things are the most fundamental basics for what any president who wishes to claim that he or she is pro-Israel must do. Let me stop here for a minute because there may be people who have questions or comments. There are a couple of other points that I will make. Maybe somebody who hasn't, spoken. We've had a number of people who always speak, but somebody who hasn't spoken at all would like to, or not, I guess. Go ahead, Sophia, if you want to unmute, and then Dr. Cantor. Yes, Sophia, you have to unmute though. I can't unmute you. You have to, yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Sorry. I wanted to ask a question about Trump and Israel. I know a lot of people don't like him and so on, but I have to confess I voted for him because of Israel, and he delivered what I expected.
So we're not going to talk about the past election, or this is a non-partisan, and I'm certainly not going to engage in whether Trump was good for or bad for. People felt what they felt, and the remarks that I am making are very much to larger generalities that existed before 2016 and 2020 and will exist, I believe, way into the future. So that's where I will stick, and I appreciate and respect, as an American, you voted for whom you voted because of what you felt. So it's important for all of us to vote and exercise our democratic right. Dr. Cantor.
Yeah, it was about 2 years ago when I made a adult education presentation at the Jacksonville Jewish Center. I was talking about the evolving Earth, how Earth has changed since when it was formed. Then when we had a question and answer period, somebody in the audience said, well, what about climate change? And I said, it is real. But then I said, and this is a few years ago, but if the election were held tomorrow, and I didn't mean to be political, I said I would vote for Trump because of his very pro-Israeli policies. That went over as a lead brick. And I was really surprised. I mean, I didn't expect that, and I didn't mean to be political. But now when you're saying that in the 30s, the 30% support that Israel's the primary concern. When it came to this election, just what my own feeling was, I was on the fence. I wasn't sure whom I was going to vote for. And my son said to me, how can you consider voting for Trump because he's, in his words, a pathological liar? That's what really got me to vote for Biden. And then other people which were pushing me, Jews for Biden, I actually thanked them for it after what happened last Wednesday. So, but I'm really surprised that the Jewish community does not feel that Israel is a primary concern because of Iran, existential threat, etc. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. Well, again, I'm going to not get into specifics, but I do believe, and again, I think that this is part of the nonpartisan guide to being a Jewish voter, is that it is more than okay to also be thinking about a variety of other issues, and not only Israel, when you go into an American voting booth as an American. And that is not a litmus test of whether you're loyal to Israel or loyal to America. It's a both and. It's not an either or. And I don't know who made it an either or. And I would also, again, and I say this in a bipartisan spirit, and in the spirit of the little video we just saw, that not all who serve in Congress but the vast majority are friends of Israel. And they are blue and they are red. And it is important that we maintain that relationship and make it bipartisan, because while the color of the Congress, blue or red, changes, now it's all blue. It's a narrow margin, but it's all blue. We cannot afford to make Israel, quote unquote, a political issue of any one party, which is to say that there'll be times when we have no entree and that we don't have supporters. If we make this a political party partisan issue, we are not doing Israel a favor. Those who love Israel, and I'm not saying you're Republican, vote Republican. You're Democrat, vote Democrat. But this notion that it can be turned into, this is the party that is pro-Israel and this is the party that's anti-Israel, that has never been the way that we have operated. And if we choose to operate that way as an American Jewish community, we do so at our peril, and we do Israel ultimately no favors, ironically. I saw a Wolpoff hand, and then Larry Goldberg. Yes, Lawrence, did you want to say something? You have to unmute though. Lawrence, you want to? You have to unmute. I wish I could unmute for people, but I can't. Okay, Marty to the rescue.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Florence. All right. Maybe while maybe.
Okay. And I would like to say that Israel is, excuse me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I was a history teacher. So when I taught the middle of the line. So I understand and I hear what you're saying. Where I come from, Israel is very important. And what I'm a little discouraged about is that there are many Jews that I meet here in New York that Israel is not on their agenda. And that bothers me very much. And through my own experience, because of the work I do, I will tell you, I represent an women's league at the United Nations, and I've had the opportunity to go to the opening sessions. The last time, September 2019, I sat in a session with Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head of the Palestinians. And I have to tell you this, that when he walked into that General Assembly, the applause he got was unbelievable. And he spoke, he said, quote, and I have it in my notes, "I am very proud of the money that we give the terrorists who kill the Israelis."
Yeah.
Then he said, when I will go, I will not make peace with just an American. I want other countries to come in and negotiate. Today, I saw that there are 4 or 5 countries that have gotten together that are beginning to discuss the Palestinian issue. And then he said, of course, this was 2019, and when I go home, we're going to have elections. There were many other things. I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned that on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Elliot Engel was the chairman. He happens to be, he represented my district and a friend. The gentleman who won the election is not pro-Israel. Is not pro-Israel at all. He is very much like AOC and Rashid. In New York, we have the Jewish Community Relations Council, who takes newly elected officials to Israel. The last one, AOC, didn't go. And from what he is talking about, I don't think he has been approached yet, but I'm not so sure he is going to go. So I am very concerned how this will turn around and how this will evolve in the Congress. And I spoke up today is because I had firsthand knowledge, and I think I have to tell the people what I saw, because I'm in the circles that I go and the people that I meet in New York. Israel is not number one on their agenda.
Right. No, and I appreciate that, Florence. Look, very quickly, and then Larry, I know would like to say something. Number one, the fact that there are almost as many Jews who think, having a Jewish sense of humor is as important as Israel. That's only we can solve that. The Republican Party won't solve it. The Democratic Party won't solve it. That's an issue where our acculturation and our assimilation is something that only we in the aggregate can, as a Jewish community, can change if we can. I don't know if we can, but that's an internal problem, a very, very significant one. To say that American Jews may have other issues when they go into the voting booth as a voter, again, it's not an either or. Speaking as a rabbi now, Israel is very important to me. It goes with me into the voting booth, but there's also room for other things as well. The fact that for some Israel is not an issue at all, that's a huge problem for the American Jewish community to address. The other thing is again that there are a small number of those who are Democrats, but potentially could be a growing number, not to be to be complacent, but there are 435 representatives in the House. There are 4 or 5 at this point that have strident views, and they do happen to be Democrats.
That's right.
But 4 or 5 is 4 or 5. That is not a reason to abandon a party on that strength alone, any more than there were a number of Republicans, like fellow from Iowa, Steve King, who said some horrible racist and white nationalist things. I would not expect the extremes of one party to then say, everyone is tainted. We have to keep our eyes on extremes of either end of the spectrum. There is anti-Semitism of the right and of the left. But bipartisanship, it is absolutely important that Jews maintain relationships on both sides of the aisle. It is. And I say that bipartisanly and non-partisanly, as somebody who cares deeply about Israel. And I'm going to be absolutely unequivocal about that. Because I care about Israel, not just when one party is in control of the White House or the Congress, but when either party is. And I think AIPAC is 150% right on this. Larry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, Israel is an important issue, but I'm not sure that it's the litmus test or the red line. I mean, when you look at some of those numbers that you quoted from the Pew survey in terms of what makes someone Jewish, they talk about education, they talk about moral and ethical and improving the world. And so clearly those factors seem to take precedence in terms of how Jews view themselves. And so whereas Israel may be an important issue, to abandon some of those moral and ethical precepts that we stand for, just to throw them by the wayside in order to support Israel, I'm not sure that that's a wise thing. As you say, we live in this country, and what we have to consider what's important and what's good for this country, even though we do support Israel, and maybe we should support Israel since we've got Nazis marching in the streets here, and so we should be grateful for that support. But I think when you start looking at the other things that Jews find important, sometimes they take precedence over blind support for a candidate that supports Israel.
Well, I would say the beauty of this is that it need not be in either or. I have, without speaking about specifics of who I voted for, I did not feel that I had to sacrifice my love and concern for Israel for any of the other things that I care about, and vice versa.
I agree.
So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind. Let me just a couple of other things very quickly, and then I would love to hear from more people. The nonpartisan guide to picking presidents. Isolationism doesn't serve us well. Right? America can't be the policeman of the world. We saw Vietnam and the terrible fractures it caused in our society. Our long years in Afghanistan, I don't know how successful we have been there. Ultimately, Iraq. But I think we have to realize, as American Jewish voters, isolationism and anti-Semitism have often gone hand in hand historically. Right, Roosevelt, as we've seen, was a flawed president in many ways. But imagine if Charles Lindbergh and his American firsters had been successful at keeping the U.S. out of World War II. There would have been nothing left to save. At least Roosevelt understood ultimately the need to defeat Nazi Germany as an imperative, and he saw it before many in the United States did. An America that's committed to honoring her commitments abroad sends a powerful message that we mean what we say and say what we mean. And it's important also that we be seen as a moral counterweight to despotic regimes around the globe like Russia or China. There are lots of bad actors out there. How we're perceived by the world really matters. And that's a positive for Israel. It sends messages to terrorist regimes that we will be reckoned with and that we honor our commitments and we take care of our friends. When we bail out of a country, we have to be careful because that sends messages to our enemies. They are watching very, very carefully. And our support and membership in NATO and other alliances, augments our strength, especially since we can't be everywhere and all things to all people. Keep in mind that the cornerstone of NATO is Article 5. It states that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all its members. NATO has been around for 75 years. It's only invoked Article 5 once in its history. And that was as a result of 9/11. So a robust foreign policy in which we maintain our alliances while understanding that we cannot be all things to all people, to me, is yet another variable in what Jews should consider when going into the voting booth. The third thing is separation of church and state. Whether a president is personally religious or not is a matter of personal conscience. We've seen presidents who were not members of particular churches. Lincoln was not. Roosevelt wasn't much of a churchgoer. Nixon came from a Quaker background, but was not either. There were those who were deeply religious. Grover Cleveland, you remember Grover. Wilson, Truman. Religiosity has never been a predictor of attitude toward faiths other than Christianity or the importance of separation of church and state. So I think that's not the issue. But a candidate's attitude on the separation of church and state impacts directly on whether or not Jews are placed in uncomfortable situations, whether in school settings, government, courthouses, and not so much in New York City, more so in Jacksonville, more so in Middleburg. And I hear the stories with the one or two Jewish kids, you know, have to suffer through encroachments of church and state. So, you know, as Jews, we're members of a religious minority, obviously, and we have to be aware of that relationship between religion and state with the First Amendment and that, you know, Jeffersonian wall of separation between the two. So I think, you know, the public policy agenda of the American Jewish community should be guided by what best serves our community's values and interests in a democratic and pluralistic society. And by the way, the Orthodox here again, just as Orthodoxy tends to skew more Republican, Orthodoxy has a much higher tolerance for infringements of church and state, especially funds for yeshivot, including those that don't teach secular studies, right? State-funded religious instruction, of which there have been myriad court cases and sometimes, unfortunately, public funds that were illegally dispersed to such an end in ultra-Orthodox communities in New York State. Or dispensations from civil rights and 14th Amendment protections. Now, obviously, you know, the freedom of religion allows religions to discriminate. They do. I mean, you know, Catholic Church only ordains men as priests, and it is absolutely protected constitutionally. Synagogues, you know, Orthodox synagogues have a mechitza. Women don't count in the minyan. We don't call non-Jews for aliyot. I mean, you know, yes, religious institutions, quote unquote, you know, I hate that word discriminate because I don't think it's, you know, it's discriminatory. I think you're being, you know, authentic and true to your own religious beliefs. But where things get much stickier is issues like female bus drivers in school buses that are paid for by public tax dollars that are transporting, you know, boys from ultra-Orthodox schools. And when a publicly funded school bus won't allow women to drive because there are boys in the bus. And so that's, I mean, that's where it gets a lot grayer. But I think in general, the separation of church and state is an important safeguard for us as a religious minority in the United States. I was going to talk a little bit about the Johnson Amendment of separating, you know, churches from, you know, political speech, but I'm going to skip that in view of the time. But the last thing that I would say is it is very important for a president to robustly condemn xenophobia and religious and ethnic prejudice. Racism and xenophobia are brothers from the same mother of anti-Semitism. So on you know, on the one hand, there is anti-Semitism of the left that often masquerades as anti-Zionism. But it's no more and no less acceptable than anti-Semitism of the right. Now, we've seen candidates who privately held anti-Semitic views, who were also incredibly strong supporters of Israel, right? Now, you know, were they hypocrites in a sense? Maybe. But the key here is that they knew their attitudes were out of sync with the tone of being the president and the need to maintain the dignity of the office. So Truman confided his anti-Semitic remarks to his diary, maybe to Bess. After he was president, he told David Susskind that, since his mother-in-law's time, Jews weren't allowed in the house. That's despicable. On the other hand, Truman helped, support the creation of the state of Israel in a way that I don't know without the United States that would have happened. You don't have to forgive Truman's despicable personal attitude, but he kept it private. So, what supporter of Israel wouldn't have taken Nixon or Truman despite their personal attitudes over FDR? FDR, who, sometimes engaged in some mild anti-Semitic rhetoric that was perfectly acceptable in his time. But he had very close Jewish friends. But let's be honest, his political courage was lacking, to say the least, at moments when hundreds of thousands, not millions, of Jewish lives were in balance. So I would say that it's important that in assessing future candidates, just because we approve a particular decision of a president where Israel is concerned, doesn't make him less an anti-Semite if he is an anti-Semite in other ways. And just because one condemns a particular decision of a president vis-a-vis Israel, doesn't make him an anti-Semite to begin with, right? Keeping our eyes wide open means that we can't allow ourselves to be fooled. There are shades of gray and nuance. Every president that has made important steps on behalf of Israel has at times also taken policies that were, perhaps not as well disposed where Israel was concerned. Israel is a sovereign government. The United States is a sovereign government. They do not always make decisions in sync with one another. There are times when Israel has made decisions that, has caused American presidents to tear their hair out, which is fine because Israel's a sovereign state. It does not need to please the desires of a particular president, and vice versa. But I think we have to look at totalities and not just several decisions without looking at the larger background. So that's my final word. And then, any other comments is that we have to look at a wide variety of issues. That is the best way of picking a president. And regardless of where you are on the left or the right, for all kinds of issues, big government, smaller government, tax and spend, don't tax and spend, don't tax, don't spend, whatever it may be. Obamacare, no Obamacare, single payer, no payer, whatever it is, vote what you believe best, but keep all of those things, keep all the plates spinning when you make a decision. Because informed decisions tend not to be simplistic black or white ones. Okay, Wendy, yes, Wendy, and then Bruce.
This isn't really about the presidents, but we might be faced with the situation again with the COVID pandemic that has gotten so absolutely horrific. When the mayor of New York, and there was another mega church somewhere where they wanted to, everybody was closed down, and this church and that huge Hasidic wedding with 7,000 people in New York. I understand that religion doesn't want to be regulated by the state, but on the other hand, for the welfare of the people of that state or that city, aren't we obligated to follow the law?
Yes. Right. Jewish law does require that when, yes. I mean, to answer your question shortly, but we'll leave that. That's a much more involved issue of constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion and assembly, and when do you apply them to religious institutions in ways that are different than other institutions, and what quote unquote is considered to be a necessary or emergency service that requires that it stay open, and I don't know what I want to get in there, but yes, avoid gatherings. I did not attend that Hasidic wedding, and it wasn't simply because I wasn't invited. Even if I had been, I wouldn't have gone.
Were
Bruce,
you in,
Yes,
were you invited?
Rabbi,
yes,
last week, when one of the congregants shared a picture that he'd been given by Richard Nixon, signed, and so I thought in the spirit of sharing, I would show you this photograph if you can see.
is that Eisenhower? I can't
That's
really tell.
Eisenhower, and to his right, you can't see?
I see Eisenhower. Who's the good-looking guy to his right?
And to his right, that's me. He came to Atlanta in my junior year in college, and he asked to meet some students from Emory, and the college was kind enough, and I was very humbly that I was requested to meet with him. So we had a private meeting in his hotel suite with coffee and a several-hour conversation, which was a very life-changing event for me.
This was after he was no longer in office, I'm assuming, because he looks older.
Correct. This was probably 1966 or 67.
Okay. Well,
Correct. He was no longer in office.
Caption says, I'm considering another run. Bruce, would you be my vice president?
Thank you.
No. I by the way, I was just looking at Bruce Jurgen's letter to International USY, I guess it was some kind of magazine that writing about civil rights, and yeah, I have a copy of that letter. And
that was actually what, Rabbi, it was not actually a letter. It was the speech that I delivered at the International Convention. Yes, it was a speech. It was the
maybe 64.
Correct. It was 64. And yes. And I was asked to do that by Danny Siegel. The previous president of the Southeast region had been asked the year before. But the history behind that is he was from Birmingham, and his father owned a furniture store, and he was afraid that if he made this speech in favor of civil rights, his father's store would be burned and torched. So that resolution did not come to the USY floor until the following year, when Danny asked me if I would deliver the speech and nominate this resolution, which I did.
And I can see how proud Alana looks. He's beaming with pride. And that's why, obviously, Eisenhower wanted to ask you to be his VP.
Thanks.
But that's a pretty cool photo. Dr. Canner?
Thank you.
Yeah, with respect to one's love for Israel and America, they don't conflict. For instance, an analogy is, one could be asked, do you love your mother more or do you love your father more? It's a ridiculous question because you love them both equally and they don't conflict with each other. In the same, Israel could be considered your mother, and America could be considered your father, and there's not mutual exclusive.
I agree 100%. I have never, thankfully, and I'm blessed to live in a country where I have never felt going into a voting booth that I had to choose in that regard. And we shouldn't take that for granted. Somebody else who wanted to just offer a comment before we, Alana?
Hi. Yeah, I think the Israel thing is interesting because I do have, I don't know if it's a generational thing. I kind of have a different view than it sounds like a lot of people have. I guess I would not say mother and father. Like I would say like a really wonderful neighbor who I've known for a long time and who I really care about, but isn't my family. And I guess it's interesting because I do care about Israel, but to me, it's not, I mean, I'm American and that's to me, like, that's what I vote on. And I mean, I wouldn't, vote for somebody who had a very, who was wanting to do BDS or, somebody who was very aggressively anti-Israel. But because I think that would also speak to other values that they had too. But to me, I vote for America. So I thought it was an interesting comparison
no.
to mother, father.
Sure. Well, I mean, you can change the analogy around, in whatever way, but, so let me just wrap things up. I really appreciate everybody, who has joined over the course of, 9 sessions. We are going to take a little break. Next week is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and, we're going to be back Monday night at the beginning of February. And I am mulling over one of 2 different Monday night series. It will be again a series. I'm thinking about doing something actually a little more text oriented with King Saul. It was a fascinating. I mean, you could read the book of 1 Samuel and think about the politics going on in this country today. So use a really, really interesting biblical figure as a lens to look at political leadership, or something just totally fun, like a look at Hollywood and Jews. So I'm just mulling between. If you have a choice, if you have a vote, you're welcome to just email me. But that will be Monday night, February 1st, and there will be there'll definitely be publicity. Erev Groundhog Day, so it's Groundhog Day Eve on Monday, February 1st. So what could be better to usher in Groundhog Day than some Jewish learning? I want to again thank everybody, and I hope that on some level, you either learned something that you hadn't known, or it's given you some. For me, history is always the lens with which I look through at the present and the future. Not that history is an always predictor, but it's important that we know our history, and also know that so many of the things we think are new aren't. They've already happened in one way or another, and we need to learn from them. So, Erev Tov to everybody.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I do appreciate
Thank
the
you.
insightful, thoughtful discussions over this time, and I'm looking forward to Saul or Hollywood, whatever you come up with. I'm sure it'll be great. Thanks so
Saul
much.
and
Hollywood. Well,
Yes.
thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
good evening.
Good
Bye.
night.